I'm Alex Kava, and I grew up just outside of Silver Creek, Nebraska. And I went to college in Omaha at College of St. Mary and have stayed. And so I've been living in Omaha since, 1978. I have a bachelor's degree in art and English, and I actually had an art scholarship to go. That's why I chose College of St. Mary. And almost all of my work background is in marketing, advertising, public relations. I had my own graphic design firm for 6 years called Square One, and always enjoyed writing, but was doing it sort of in a backdoor kind of way. It does because I love using Nebraska in my books, and I love doing it because so few people know anything about Nebraska. And I'm not even just talking about the geography and the typography, I'm talking about just people. They seem to think that being from the Midwest that we should be somehow stranger or different or slower and not get the kinds of things that you'd get if you're in the East or the West. And it was interesting because I had written 4 books before I wrote One False Move, which all takes place in Nebraska. And I had never ever gotten a review before that called me a Nebraska writer until One False Move. And it was a national reviewer that said it. It was in Publishers Weekly, actually, that called me a Nebraska writer. And I thought that was interesting because I had been including bits and pieces of Nebraska and Omaha in my books, but not until that book did they actually notice that I was from Nebraska. You know, there are a lot of people who have had influences, not directly. You know, when I've been on the road, especially in Nebraska, I always mention my 6th grade teacher, Mrs. Powers, who would read to us after lunch every day, and that just really instilled a love of reading in me. And my 8th grade teacher, Mr. Myers, I remember him reading to us The Telltale Heart, and he had one of these really deep voices, and you could hear the heart beating. So things like that really made an influence in me wanting to be a writer and wanting to do that. It wasn't, though, until I was sort of at a crossroads in my life, and I had always loved writing short stories when I was a kid, 12, 13, 14, but I would hide them. I would hide them under the bed and not show anyone. And ironically, when I did go on to college, I majored in English as well as art. I got the art scholarship. And I still loved writing. I did a lot of writing in my business ventures, but it was always business writing. And so it wasn't until I was really at a crossroads in my life and I thought, you know, I don't want to do advertising and marketing anymore. I want to do something else. And so I gave myself the opportunity to take time off and write a book. And fortunately for me, that book was published, and the rest has sort of been a Cinderella story. I think I always knew that I wanted to be a writer, but I was always instilled growing up in the country, especially. Both my parents are children of Polish immigrants, and work ethic is very, very important, has always been very important. And I could not, for the love of me, figure out how you made a living making up stories and writing them down. So I never ever considered it. Just didn't consider that it was even an avenue, that it was something that I could take seriously. And so it wasn't even until I did sort of come to the end of my road and want to try something entirely different that I gave myself permission to write and to call myself a writer. And it's still really hard for me sometimes to consider myself in that club. You know, I think that I satisfy the need to write by continually learning. And it's hard for me to go back and even read my first books, believe it or not, because I want to do it with a red pen. And I'm constantly wanting to correct myself and edit myself. And that's a good thing, I think. I've seen a change in my writing and my technique and in my skills. And I think that that's what always challenges me and continues to challenge me. The other thing is that I love doing research. I love learning new things. And it's a little bit like going back to school, but I get to choose the topics. And sometimes my research alone sends me off into different avenues and also into different plots that I never ever thought that I would write a story about a particular character until I started doing research. So those are the kinds of things that keep me writing. It's not necessarily to write the all-American best great novel. It's to continuously learn and have fun with it and to entertain readers and to sort of interact in a way that I wasn't able to in other venues. Well, right now I'm writing a suspense thriller genre. And what really does inspire me is being able to sit down with law enforcement officers and different people who actually do what I write about. And I sit down and I listen to their stories and I listen to who they are, and it amazes me. And I'm constantly inspired by them, constantly inspired by the different stories that touch them, the different things that they do on a daily basis. And that's the thing right now that really inspires me to continue to write this particular genre. The other thing that inspires me are readers. It just amazes me how they connect to different characters. And I never intended to write a series. My Maggie Odell FBI Profiler had never ever meant to be a series. And readers just sort of really connected with that character and have kind of demanded it. In fact, my last book, A Necessary Evil, sort of came about because readers demanded that I go back to my very first book and take care of a character who I sort of let slip through. And that is such a compliment, I think, to a writer, when readers not only have connected with a character that you've tried so hard to make flesh and blood, but they want justice to be brought to that character. So that's sort of what continuously, not just inspires me, but motivates me to get up every day. Well, and I don't write every day, but to get up and to do the research and to continually to do the writing, because it is a craft too, and you have to learn your craft, and it's a lot of work. Sure it is. But it's a lot of fun to be able to connect with readers and really feel like you're doing something there that they enjoy. I think my overriding theme is good versus evil, and I am totally obsessed with this ideal of good versus evil, because I think that if all of us are capable of doing both, then why do only some of us, a few choice, go over that line? And where is that line? And all through history, we've been trying to define where that line is and why some people do and some people don't. But there are a lot of different themes and a lot of different conflicts between characters that I work through. And it's funny to say that when you're writing a suspense thriller genre, that you're very heavily character-based instead of plot-based. But when I'm coming up with my ideas, that's where I'm going to, and I'm trying to find out the conflicts between the characters and the relationships and the inner character, what people are willing to do, what pushes people to do some things. And one of the things that I'm constantly looking at about characters is that I'm very interested in pushing them to the edge, because I think that when we are pushed to the edge is when we show our true character. And that's what I want to see. I do long stretches. I do what I call my marathon writing. And a lot of it is because I don't have the opportunity to have 3-4 hours a day to do that. I'm on the road for probably about 2 months out of the year. And I do my research for about 2 to 3 months. And then I'm usually editing the previous book for another month out of the year. And when you're trying to do a book a year, which I'm contracted to do right now, it's tough. It's like you almost have only 5 to 6 months to actually write a book. So I love to do my marathons, and I will take 2 weeks, 3 weeks at a time, and that's all I do, from morning until evening or even past evening if I've got a flow going. And the reason that I do that is it's easier for me to get into character and to sort of surround myself into that background and place myself where those characters are and not be interrupted. It's hard to be distracted and interrupted. I have the opportunity to talk to an awful lot of authors about the way that they do things, and I don't know that I could ever just take an hour here and an hour there, sit down and make myself write so many words a day. It just wouldn't seem like the same story. The style has sort of stayed the same. It's funny because I use very short chapters, and I do that purposely in a way to build suspense. It drives my editor sometimes nuts, but it's something that my readers really seem to like, and I like it because I'm really distracted easily, and I read before bed, so if I can read 2-3 chapters before bed, I think I'm doing good. But that's sort of the style that I developed early on without realizing it. My technique, I think, continuously changes. I like the technique of using different points of view and not just from first person. And I like doing that because sometimes I have the characters and the telling the reader something that some of the other characters don't know yet. And I think that that builds suspense in its own little way. So there's a lot of little things that I think that I do that I don't realize is technique and style. But it's one of those things that is, I think, constantly developing and changing. And I notice it in my own writing from book to book, how much I change and grow. I would think that my audience would be mostly those people who really enjoy suspense thrillers. But I'm finding that that's not necessarily true, that a lot of mystery readers read across the board and read as much literary novels as they do genre novels. If I judge by my website and use that as a microcosm of who my readership is, it's probably about 40% male and 60% female. And it goes from very young, 14 years old, all the way up to 84, 90 actually. And that's kind of neat too, because I don't think that you can ever sort of target your writing for a particular audience. I think you have to tell the story and tell it in a way that can be entertaining but is true to the voice and true to your style. And then the readers come along for the ride or they don't come along for the ride. Oftentimes they'll let you know. You know, after 9/11, I had a really tough time writing this particular genre because it was hard for me to figure out why in the world would people want to read about murder. And that's basically what I write about. I write about ordinary characters being pushed to extraordinary circumstances, but usually the extraordinary circumstance is murder. And I had a really difficult time writing after 9/11, and part of it was because I really couldn't see that this was something that was going to do any good for the greater society. And then I met a bookstore owner who told me that after World War II, the detective novel became very, very popular. And part of the reason that it did is because in a chaotic world, readers in particular look for something to be able to put some order to that chaos. And they were doing it with the detective novel because they had all of these pieces to the puzzle and people were being murdered and there was chaos. But at the end of the novel, they had order that was brought to this. And that sort of gave me a little bit more encouragement that maybe what I was doing wasn't such a bad thing, that it was helping people in a way that was not just entertaining, but bringing some sort of order to their chaos. And I think that that's what I look to do with every book, is not necessarily to bring to light different social issues, which I sometimes do. In my latest book, it's very heavily based on the pre-scandal that happened has like through the last 40 years. And not necessarily to bring light to those particular issues, but to entertain readers, and if they take something away, if they learn something new, if they take to heart different characters, then that's a plus. The toughest part, as with early or with new writers, I guess I should say that instead of early writers, the toughest part with new writers is that they don't want to do the work oftentimes. And the very first thing I'll say, if you have a novel, then finish it, because nobody's going to even want to look at it if you're not finished with it. And we have a lot of great ideas, but sitting down and getting them on paper is sometimes the toughest thing. And I think it's romantic to have this idea for a novel and continuously be working on it, but not necessarily ever really finish it. So the very first thing that I tell writers who want to be published is finish your novel, if that's what you're working on. And then the second thing is that after you finish it and you make it the best you possibly can, then you need to put it aside and you put on your business hat and you try to sell it. Because too often we as writers take things so personally, we take rejection so personally that we are discouraged at the very first time that we get a rejection in the mail. I had 116 rejections for a novel that still sits in my bottom desk drawer. And if I had given up, I wouldn't be published today. And I was just silly enough to think that maybe I could do something about it. So I'm living proof that it can happen. I think that I read somewhere that there's like 50,000 titles that are published each year, and about 3,500 of those are fiction, and about 120 of those are new authors. You know, there's probably better odds to win the lottery than it is to get published in fiction. But unfortunately, it's probably more important to be persistent than it is to be good. And talent is something that you would like to believe that you have and you need the skill and you need to develop the skill, but then you have to be persistent. You can't let those rejections just sort of crush your dream. I'm editing my latest novel, which is called Whitewash, and it's kind of surprising because it's turning out to be a bit of a political thriller, which is different from me. I have a lot of different ideas for novels and never seem to have the time to sit down and put them on paper. But I do have a couple of them that are not suspense thrillers that probably in the next 3 years I'd like to finish up and hopefully find a publisher for. There's a Christmas story that I would love to be able to do that I've been kind of dabbling on for a long, long time. And last year, the Omaha World Herald had asked me to do a short story for their Christmas edition. So it just sort of prompted me again, reminded me that I have this idea I need to start working on. But I constantly have ideas that I keep in folders and boxes and am constantly working on something. But I'm having a lot of fun doing the suspense thrillers right now. I've been meeting a lot of neat readers and a lot of other authors and bookstore owners and librarians, and just I'm kind of enjoying where I am right now.
Good evening. My name is Meredith McGowan. I'm the curator of the Heritage Room, and I'd like to welcome you to the Heritage Room and to the John H. Ames Reading Series. We're excited that this series has been around for more than 20 years now. So we thank you for joining us this evening. We're here in the Jane Pope Geske Heritage Room of Nebraska Authors, and it is a special collection that's dedicated to preserving and promoting works by and about Nebraska authors. And right now there are almost 13,000 volumes here in the Heritage Room, and they're written by some 3,000 authors. So we do welcome you back when we're open during regular public service hours. Kind of limited, but we're open Tuesday through Friday from 12 to 3, and we're open on Sunday afternoons from 2 to 5 as well. So you're welcome to come back and look around and look at the artwork on the walls and so forth too. So we'd be glad to see you then. We'd also like to thank the Nebraska Literary Heritage Association because we're able to bring you special programs and services because of an endowment that they established, that was established through their volunteer efforts. Tonight, our reader is Alex Kava. Growing up near Silver Creek, Nebraska, Alex always wanted to be a writer. She practiced being a writer. Then after graduating from the College of St. Mary in Omaha and performing a number of different jobs, she did take the chance, dedicating more time to writing and hoping to realize her dream of becoming a published author. And apparently it worked, because she has a number of titles thus far. She has A Perfect Evil, Split Second, Soul Catcher, At the Stroke of Madness, One False Move, and A Necessary Evil. Her One False Move has been chosen as the 2006 One Book, One Nebraska selection, and she's been on a One Book, One Nebraska tour for quite a while now, but we're glad to have her here this evening. Please help me welcome her as she joins us tonight.
Well, thank you all for coming tonight. This is actually the end of the tour. I've got a couple of more stops, but I think I had the tally going there for a while. It's like 29 libraries, 26 different cities, and 34 different events. And it included 3 different book festivals too. For a while there, when we did the western part of Nebraska, we were literally 3 women and 5 dogs in an RV. I nicknamed it the Insanity Tour because I figured that by the time that we finished, if one of us had not murdered the others, one of us would surely be insane. But it's been an awful lot of fun, and having my book chosen for the One Book, One Nebraska is a huge honor. It's such a privilege because I travel a lot and I see when different cities and different states choose one book for the entire community to read. So I know how big of a deal it is. And usually, quite honestly, it's usually dead authors that are chosen. So it's even a bigger honor to have my book chosen because I get to go out and meet people and talk about books and talk about writing, which we weren't really able to do with Willow last year. But it's been a huge honor. And I do include a lot of bits and pieces about Nebraska in my novels. You know, when I first started writing fiction, somebody told me, actually there were a lot of people that told me, that you must write what you know, to be very passionate about what you're going to write. If you want to write really good fiction, write what you know. Well, I grew up in Silver Creek, Nebraska, which is about 500 people. My graduating class was 23. I went to College of St. Mary, which is an all-women's Catholic college in Omaha, and I write about murder. So I'm not writing what I know. But one thing that I do know is Nebraska, and that's what I love, to be able to include bits and pieces in my novels. And I love doing that because any of you who have done any traveling, have you ever asked anybody where Nebraska is? And have they known? It's amazing. We're in the middle of the country and nobody knows where we are. They all want to put us out by Idaho or Nevada or someplace in the Wild West. So it's an awful lot of fun to be able to do that and to include bits and pieces in my novels. In fact, when I did a national book tour for One False Move when it first came out in August of 2004, I included 18 cities across the country. And I remember getting to San Mateo, California, where there's a neat little bookstore called M is for Mystery. And I had been going there for each and every one of my books that had come out. The owner, Ed Kaufman, has just been very good to me. But I was telling Ed this particular time that when I finished the national tour, I was going back home and I was going to do an 11-city Nebraska tour. Because at the time, I wanted to include Nebraska since the book takes place almost all in Nebraska. And Ed looked at me kind of confused and he said, "Are there even 11 cities in Nebraska?" Well, I got to Scottsdale, Arizona, and I love the bookstore owner there too, Barbara Peters. If you're ever in that neck of the woods, stop in because the Poison Pen is one of the best. And Barbara's been very good to me too. And I told her about the Nebraska tour and she got all excited. She said, "Oh yes, I've been to Nebraska. I've even been to the Corn Palace." I kind of didn't have the heart to tell her that the Corn Palace is in South Dakota and she hasn't really been to Nebraska. But it's so much fun to be able to include bits and pieces of Nebraska and then have people recognize it. On this particular tour, we included Hastings, Nebraska. And any of you who have read One False Move, you know that my bank robbers eventually get to Hastings and they stay at a Comfort Inn. And at the Hastings book signing and presentation, we actually held it in a bank, which was a little bit like returning to the scene of the crime. But it was a lot of fun until the owners of that Comfort Inn introduced themselves to me. And then I was a little bit worried. But they came to me with the page open that had the Comfort Inn, and they wanted me to sign the page, and they were pretty tickled that I included it. So it was okay that my bank robbers stayed there. And I had a lot of fun telling them that I had just met a woman in Kansas City who told me that she and her husband had been to a conference in Hastings, and they stayed at his Comfort Inn. And so the only problem is that her husband was quite upset because my bank robbers got a better rate than they did. Now, my latest book, A Necessary Evil, actually the first chapter opens at Epley Airport, and a Monsignor is killed in the restroom. And I have to tell you, back in February when I was doing the book tour and doing a lot of in and outs out of Epley with airport authority, knowing who I was a little bit nervous. But this summer, a friend of mine had another friend fly in with her from Epley, and the friend required a wheelchair, so they had to contact airport authority, and he brought a wheelchair for them. And as he was wheeling them by the bookstore there in the airport, he stopped, and my book was in the window, and he pointed at it, and he said, "In that book, there's a murder that happens in that restroom right around the corner, and it's a priest who's killed." So it's kind of fun when people recognize stuff and they point it out like it's almost like it's real life, like it's a real part of a crime of some sort. Now, I do have to tell you, when I was in Pittsburgh on my tour for One False Move, I met a woman there who had been to Nebraska a couple of years before, and she said it was so much fun to read One False Move because she recognized a lot of those little towns that I took my bank robbers through. She said it was so neat, especially it was so vivid when she was on I-80, and she could so vividly remember that exit sign for Normal, Nebraska. Normal, Nebraska does not exist. It is a figment of my imagination, but it is such a compliment when readers can't tell the difference. That means that I got enough of it right that I made the reader wonder what's real and what's not real. And that's a lot of fun to be able to do. Tonight I'm going to read a little something from One False Move. This particular book was inspired, I should say, it was inspired by a real-life crime. And I was actually staying out at Platte River State Park in March of 2001. And for any of you who've been around the park, it's very, very quiet. My dogs and I were the only ones in one of the cabins. And there's 13 cabins around the lake. And about 6 o'clock in the evening, I heard a police helicopter. Actually, I didn't know it was a police helicopter until I stepped outside and I could see the words police on the helicopter. It was flying that low. And when I went back into the cabin, I turned on my portable TV and learned that there was a bank robbery in Lincoln, and 2 bank robbers had gotten away. I don't know if any of you remember this. They shot a couple just outside of Greenwood, Nebraska, and stole their pickup. And I was in the middle of that manhunt. Now, I can write about this stuff. I don't necessarily have to live through it to be able to write about it. So it started getting dark, and I literally picked up both dogs and left everything in the cabin and headed back for Omaha. And I had to go through a police barricade on one side of the park, and they told me there was another one out by South Bend. So I literally was in the middle of this manhunt for these bank robbers. Well, I got back to Omaha and I decided I have the best idea for a novel. And I started writing down notes, pages and pages and pages of notes. Only I had to put it aside because I still owed my publisher another Maggie Odell. Maggie's my series character. And so I put away the notes, and it probably was about 1.5 years later that I pulled them back out, and I started writing One False Move. Now, I was probably about a quarter of the way through when 3 men walked into a Norfolk bank and left 5 people dead and got away with no money. And it was really pretty strange because my book was very similar, and I was already a quarter of a way through. In my book, 2 men walk into an Omaha bank and walk out with no money, and they leave 4 people dead. And it was pretty surreal because even though I base a lot of my books on real-life crimes, I usually include bits and pieces of real-life crimes in each and every book, this was very surreal because it was real life, sort of imitating something that I thought I had created only in my mind. That was too fantastic to really happen. In fact, when I started writing the book, to tell you the truth, I didn't think people would probably believe me that it could happen. And I have a brother who lives in Norfolk, and his wife knew one of the victims, so it was personal. But being on this tour of Nebraska for One False Move, it's been interesting how many people think that the book was inspired by the Norfolk bank robbery. In fact, before I made my presentation, I believe it was in South Sioux City, there was a woman who came up to me and she said, I read your book, and I kept waiting for the bank robbers to get to Norfolk, and they don't. And then, of course, after she heard what had really inspired it, she realized that it wasn't based on the Norfolk bank robbery. I did have access to a lot of information from that particular crime. I was able to sit down with one of the 2 crime lab techs who processed the bank, and he took me through it step by step. And so I did include a couple of pieces of evidence and decided that was enough, that I was going to stick to my original story and not try to imitate that particular bank robbery, because it has affected so many people. And it's, it's 4 years later, and it's amazing how many people it still affects. Being on this tour, I met so many people who were somehow involved. When I was in O'Neill, Nebraska, there was a woman who introduced herself to me, and she told me that she was working at the McDonald's that day, and she was the one that made the call into the police and turned in Jose Sandovar. And she said the thing that was really freaky about that is that when the police came to get him, he asked them if he could finish his hamburger. I couldn't make that up. Sometimes true, real-life stuff is just so much stranger than fiction. I couldn't even make up something like that. And I've been meeting people across the state who have introduced themselves and have somehow been connected to that particular crime. I was in Louisville talking to a group of students, 6th graders through seniors, a couple of weeks ago. And I told them my story about being out at Platte River State Park and the book. And after I finished, there was a group that stayed behind, and there was a little boy who introduced himself to me. He wanted me to know that his grandparents were that Greenwood couple who were shot. Now, they survived, and And I asked him how they were and how he was doing, and it wasn't like he was upset about it. He just wanted to know that there was a connection with something that I had written about. So it's kind of a little bit weird to me that something that I write about that I believe is just fiction has such an impact on so many different people, and they still have such a connection to it. It kind of is a little bit awesome, for lack of another better word. But I've met a lot of people over the last, gosh, we've been doing this since September 7th, and it's just been a lot of fun to be able to really meet Nebraskans who didn't even know that I was a writer from Nebraska. So it's been very special, and I want to thank you all for being a part of that. One False Move is about a bank robbery, and it takes place in Nebraska. All of it does. My bank robbers rob a bank, as I said, get away with no money, and end up leaving 4 people dead in the bank. And they do end up finding their way to Platte River State Park, where there's an author who's trying to finish his novel, and the author's initials just happen to be AK. Not that I was trying really hard to insert myself into the book, but I did do that on purpose. I wanted to be a part of the book without, driving readers crazy. But I want to read you a first chapter, one of the first chapters here with Melanie Starks. Melanie is a very different character. She is a mother who has a son, a 17-year-old son. And I should tell you, too, that other than the Norfolk bank robbery, there was another crime that I did a lot of research on, and it influenced One False Move quite a bit. And that happened in 1958. And it was the Charlie Starkweather rampage. And any of you who have read the book know that I even named one of my characters, Melanie Starks' son, Charlie Starks, after Charlie Starkweather. And I gave Charlie and his uncle Jared quite a few different personality traits of Charlie Starkweather, and kind of interwove a few different bits and pieces about that particular crime, because I wanted my rampage to be reminiscent of that crime as well. In fact, there's a scene, I'm not going to read it to you tonight, but there's a scene where in real life, Charlie and Carol Ann get to a farmhouse, and they tie up the farmer and they steal his vehicle. But right before they're getting ready to leave, Charlie goes back into the house, and he comes back out with the farmer's pack of cigarettes, and he tells Carol Ann, "I know for a fact that farmer just stopped smoking, and and she knew that he was dead." So in my book, I have the robbers coming to a farmhouse, and they tie up the farmer, and they're getting ready to take his vehicle, and Jared runs back in, and he comes back wearing the farmer's Husker cap, and he tells the others, "I know for a fact that farmer's not going to be wearing this anymore," and without seeing it. And I should say, too, that even though my books are suspense thrillers and a lot about murder, and people this past tour have been telling me that they're quite gruesome, and my answer to that is that I never ever take a reader through a murder. I won't do that. I love the Alfred Hitchcock approach, where I take you to the edge and I leave you there. And the reason that I do that is because I'm thinking that you're a lot more twisted, and your imaginations are a lot more twisted than anything I can put into words. So, Melanie Starks, 7 a.m., Omaha, Nebraska. Melanie Starks quickened her pace. The sun peeked over the bell towers of St. Cecilia's Cathedral. The days were already growing shorter. Summer was almost over, but was making one last grand stand. It was only the beginning of her walk, and already Melanie could feel her breathing becoming labored. The air was thick and heavy with moisture. She studied the horizon in the opposite direction. Having cursed sunrises for years, she almost hated to admit how much she enjoyed them now. But this morning's sunrise gave her a bad feeling, even a sudden chill as a trickle of sweat made its way down her back. The sun was barely able to squeeze through the storm clouds that were gathering, a gravestone gray, sky streaked blood red. It was an eerie combination, and she could hear her mother repeating one of her silly superstitions. Red sky in morning, sailor take warning. Red sky at night, sailor's delight. The weather only seemed to fuel her restlessness, to ignite her disappointment, her frustration. Oh, hell, she should call it what it was, her anger. Yeah, that's right, she was angry, pissed off, Jared hadn't been back 2 weeks and already things were changing. She resented having to cut short her morning walk. What was it about his sudden freedom that took precedent over her own? That's what it felt like when he called last night and left the message to meet her for breakfast, summoning her as if he could still boss her around, just like when they were kids. He used that brief yet demanding tone of his. "Meet me at the place we talked about. It's time." "It's time," she mimicked under her breath. She had no idea what the hell he was talking about. It was as if he was talking in code, as if they were kids again, plotting one of their childhood conspiracies. Ever since he had gotten back, he had been planning something big, or so he kept saying. But of course he couldn't tell her until it was time. That was Jared, so secretive and always calling the shots. He expected complete loyalty with no question and no hesitation. It had always been that way. Like the Rebecca Moore thing, Jared didn't even bother explaining. Instead, he insisted the police got it wrong. Melanie knew that could happen. She had seen it happen years before. She pumped her arms, keeping her pace and not letting her anger slow her down. She hated that Jared made her feel like she still owed him. It didn't help that she wasn't there for him during his trial. It was as if nothing had changed in the 5 years that he had been away, and yet everything had changed. She had changed, or at least she thought she had. Although it couldn't have been very much, why else would she be rushing to meet him, rushing once again to do whatever her big brother told her to do, like cutting short what had become her daily ritual, her daily gospel, and the replacement for a quick fix of nicotine, and later still for 4 cups of hot, scorching coffee. The coffee had helped her get through the initial withdrawal from the cigarettes. Now this new addiction, a 3-mile morning walk, replaced the caffeine. She didn't need Dr. Phil to see that she was simply transferring compulsions. She took the same walk every day at the same time, even walked at the same pace. Only today, she had to quicken the pace if she intended to meet Jared. Quicken, she decided, but not cut short. She pushed back her shoulders as if one defiant thought was the same as standing up to her big brother. Something she had never been able to do in the past. But that was the past. Maybe Jared needed to see that she wasn't that same little girl he could boss around. She was an adult, a grown woman with her own son. She had been forced to grow up while Jared seemed to live in the past, even moving back in with their mother when he was released from jail. That was a mistake. Their mother was crazy, with all her black magic and superstitions. Certifiably crazy, or so she and Jared liked to claim, making up any kind of excuse for why she kept picking loser husbands like both their dads. Saying their mother was crazy seemed better than admitting that she was simply stupid. Maybe that was Jared's problem. Melanie thought about teasing him, that maybe he had inherited Mom's crazy gene, though she knew full well that she would never dare to tease Jared. He would see it as a betrayal, and he would remind her again that all they had were each other because of the past they had survived and the secrets they continued to share. Melanie turned left at 52nd and Nicholas Street and headed into the Memorial Park neighborhood, a stretch of huge brick homes with carefully manicured lawns, not a ceramic gnome in sight. That made her smile, thinking of her son Charlie's newest obsession of stealing lawn ornaments, even though it annoyed her as much as it amused her. She couldn't help thinking that maybe it was another example, like mother, like son. After all, she had taught him well, making a game early on of their escapades. It may have started as a game, but it bugged her that Charlie still treated stealing as a game, completely unaware of the risks and the dangers. Yes, she had taught him well, maybe a little bit too well. She had brought him in when he was only 8. They stole packs of ground beef, quickly graduating to T-bone steaks from the Hy-Vee on Center Street, stuffing them into his school backpack. Charlie became so good at it, she didn't even notice him steal the Hostess Twinkies and the Bazooka bubblegum until they appeared later on their kitchen table, alongside the packs of meat. He was a natural, and now, 9 years later, with that baby face and lopsided grin, he could still get away with almost anything. Their game had started as a matter of survival, a way to supplement Melanie's string of shitty jobs. So what if Charlie swiped a few silly lawn ornaments, so long as he brought home a leather jacket or enough CD players to pay the rent? What did it matter that he still considered hot wiring Saturns a game? Maybe it was that carefree attitude that kept him from getting caught, though Melanie worried that it had more to do with luck than attitude. They had had a long string of good luck. And lately, she found herself not trusting it to hold up, but she didn't dare tell Charlie that. Luck and a little bit of opportunity. That had been their ticket out of the stink hole she grew up in. For the last 10 years, she had provided a nice home for herself and Charlie in the middle of Dundee, a respectable Omaha neighborhood. A good family neighborhood, though not quite like this one. She thought as she looked around. She kept to the sidewalks, wondering if anyone behind these huge decorative doors would understand. How could they with their polished black BMWs and Lexus SUVs in their driveways? Not a missing hubcap or a spot of rust in sight, let alone a homemade in transit sign scotch taped to the rear window. She walked past the only pickup parked in the street, a white Chevy, and she knew before she saw the attached beat-up trailer that the truck belonged to a lawn service. Then she saw two young men, shirtless and glistening with sweat, down on their knees on the front lawn of the house. They both had what looked like oversized scissors, and they were cutting blades of grass from in between the pristine white picket fence, obviously unable to use their array of machinery on their trailer for fear of scarring the white wood. Melanie resisted the urge to laugh. Jesus, what did it cost to have something like that done? She wanted to roll her eyes and make some sympathetic gesture in recognition of their plight, but then they would have known. They would have realized that she didn't belong here either, that she was an outsider too. So instead, she just smiled and continued walking. She checked her wristwatch, a sleek black-faced Movado with a single diamond that Charlie had given her on Mother's Day. She didn't bother asking him anymore how he got things or from where. She couldn't help thinking the watch belonged in this neighborhood, even if she did not. It was then that she saw the 8x10 piece of cardboard nailed to a tree. She remembered noticing the tree soon after it was ravaged by last week's thunderstorms. The wounded maple managed to keep only its trunk intact, the branches ripped off, leaving behind what now looked like two severed arms still reaching in surrender to the sky. This morning, someone had added a hand-printed sign, a sort of public epistle that read, "Hope is a thing with feathers." In small print below was written, Emily Dickinson. Melanie glanced at the house the tree belonged to, but didn't slow her pace. She repeated the phrase to herself, "Hope is a thing with feathers." She snorted under her breath. What the hell was that supposed to mean? And besides, what did people with brick mansions and BMWs need to know about hope? What problems could they possibly have that couldn't be solved with their money? She remembered what Jared always said, that people who had money didn't have a clue about people who didn't have money. Melanie looked back at the tree. Even from almost a block up the street, that poor, ugly thing stood out in the middle of this picture-perfect neighborhood. It didn't need a stupid quote from some dead poet tacked onto its pathetic remains to remind it that it didn't belong. Hope is a thing with feathers, she repeated, but still didn't understand. Was somebody poking fun? Or maybe pointing out that they were above having an ugly tree in their front yard? Surely they didn't think hope was going to save it, so it had to be a joke, or some highbrow message. It didn't matter. Why was she even wasting her time with it? One thing she knew for certain, hope was something that only people in brick mansions could afford to count on. People like herself and Charlie and Jared counted on luck. A little bit of luck could make things happen. She and Jared had crawled up from the same stinking hole. That was the one thing they understood about each other. She glanced at her wristwatch again. Maybe things hadn't changed as much as she thought, and she picked up her pace. No sense in pissing off Jared. We have a little bit more time. I think if you allow me, I'd like to read something from A Necessary Evil, if that's okay. A Necessary Evil is the book that came out in February, and it actually takes place in Washington, D.C. and also in Omaha. It's the one that has the murder of the Monsignor. And it is a book that I wrote in response to my very first novel, which was A Perfect Evil. I sort of ended A Perfect Evil with sort of a cliffhanger, and readers didn't really like that. In fact, no matter where I went, whether it was East Coast, West Coast, Midwest, whether I was in Italy, Germany, England, Ireland, they demanded that I write a second book to follow up on it. Well, it took me 5 years because I had no idea how to do it. I intended to leave A Perfect Evil the way it ended, and I didn't intend to go back. So A Necessary Evil is really one of those examples where this book was written especially for the readers. And I remind people that in this day and age where publishers are trying to shove down readers' throats books that they think that we should be reading, A Necessary Evil is an example where readers demanded it and they got it. And the book is even dedicated to readers. It takes place in Omaha and Washington, I guess I did say that. And Tommy Bakula from One False Move returns from that particular novel. And the way that came about is when I realized that Maggie was going to be coming back to Omaha, I could have created an entirely new detective. But I loved Tommy so much that I decided that Maggie needs to meet Tommy Bakula. And Tommy Bakula is the very first character that I've ever created who's mirrored from somebody that I know. And I remember the very first time that I met the real-life Tommy Bakula. He said to me, "I hate the way you writers portray detectives in your novels. You always make us these drunks who are divorced, or our wives have left us, or our wives have been killed by some horrendous murder." He says, "Why can't you give us real lives? Why can't you make us real people?" And he's right, because even my character Maggie Odell is, for any of you who have read any of those, pretty dysfunctional. She doesn't have a home life. She's pretty dedicated to her career, but she doesn't really have much social graces about her at all. She has an alcoholic, suicidal mother. So I decided when I did Omaha Police Detective Tommy Bakula for One False Move, I decided that I was going to give him Bill's real life. Tommy Bakula married his high school sweetheart, who he's still crazy about. He has 4 daughters. He's an usher at St. Stan's. And there is one thing that I did get wrong. I didn't realize that no self-respecting South Omaha guy would ever coach soccer. It's softball, it's never soccer. So Bill set me straight on that. But in this chapter that I'm going to read now, Tommy Bakula is sent to the Archdiocese office when they discover that there are priests that are being killed in different parts of the country. And they pretty much realize that there's sort of some politics involved in the Omaha diocese, and the police need to proceed quite, how should I say this, politically correct. Not that is based on anything real. I'm Catholic, so I feel like I get to say that. But so Tommy is in the Archdiocese office waiting for the Archbishop. Tommy Bakula shifted his weight, but there was no getting comfortable in the hardback chair. It sat low in front of the gaudy, ornate desk, lower, he was certain, on purpose. Probably so that when the Archbishop sat behind the desk, he would be looking down on his visitor. That was when the Archbishop would finally grace his visitor with his presence. Bakula was almost certain that that this waiting was part of the intimidation. He had nothing better to do than look at the huge frame portraits on the wall behind the desk, a line of past archbishops. He recognized only Curtis and Sheehan, and Curtis seemed to be staring him down. He shifted in the chair again, glancing around the rest of the room. Sterile was the word that came to mind. He wanted to run an index finger over the windowsill, maybe the top of the bookshelf, just to see if any dust dared exist in His Holiness's presence. He wouldn't be here if Chief Ramsey hadn't insisted on one last-ditch publicity attempt just to say that they had made every effort before they announced they were calling in the feds. Bakula had never met Archbishop Armstrong. Chief Ramsey had acted surprised at that revelation. "But aren't you one of those offertory collectors or some crap like that for St. Stan's?" the chief had asked, obviously not worried about revealing his own long-expired Catholicism. Truth was, being a part of the church meant more to Claire than it did to him, but he had given in, wanting his daughters to grow up knowing enough of what was available to reject or accept. Claire had even pointed out to him that they must have done something right because their oldest, Angie, had decided on her own to stay in Omaha and go to Claire's alma mater, Creighton University. And she had been serious enough about it to work hard all through her final years of high school to land a soccer scholarship that would thankfully help pay for the expensive but prestigious college. He already ribbed Angie that if she wasn't leaving Omaha to go to college, he wouldn't be able to bring his punching bag and all of his weights in from the garage and take over her bedroom just yet. But he had to admit he was proud of her, and he liked keeping her close, being able to watch over her for at least a few more years. Of course, he also looked forward to going to the games and watching her play on the Creighton soccer team this fall. She had bragged that they have VIP seats for all the parents. He stopped himself from telling her bleachers were still bleachers to his butt. A door opened, startling him, and he caught himself sitting up straight, almost as if he was in church and had fallen asleep during the sermon. He twisted around in the chair, not sure what was appropriate. Should he stand? Why the hell stand? Mr. Bakula, Archbishop Armstrong, said it like an announcement, only getting the pronunciation wrong, so that it ended up being Bakula instead of Bakula. It's Bakula and it's detective, he said, correcting the Archbishop. Getting it wrong was just another way he thought he could intimidate Bakula, make him feel he needed to explain himself. He noticed the Archbishop standing alongside his desk, hesitating. Was he waiting for Bakula to stand? Chief Ramsey had assured him he needed to be polite, but no sucking up was necessary. Bakula remained seated. Czech? Polish. Ah, yes, of course, Armstrong said, and glided to his chair behind his desk, finally taking his place, as if the ancestry of Bakula's name was something they needed to get out of the way, as if that might help him understand Bakula. The chair seemed to swallow the Archbishop's tall, lean body. Evidently he was aware of its effect, because immediately he sat forward on the edge of the seat with his hands in front of him on the desk, clasped, almost reverently, as if in constant prayer mode. They were the smallest hands Bakula had seen on a man, smooth, not a callus or cuticle in sight, with buffed, pearly, white-tipped nails. Definitely a professional manicure. So much for that vow of poverty. What can I do to help you, Mr. Bakula? He asked, with a tilt of his head to show concern, but already purposely exchanging detective for Mr. Bakula recognized it for another maneuver or strategy in the Archbishop's game of control. The detective decided to ignore it for now. You offered your assistance through Brother Sebastian. I wondered if you might have some thoughts, some insights, on who could have killed Monsignor O'Sullivan. No sense in beating around the bush, be it burning or camouflaged. Who indeed, Archbishop Armstrong said in a deep voice, as if it were the beginning of a sermon. He opened his clasped hands, holding them palms up before bringing them to the desk again, this time slowly tapping them, all 10 fingertips on the desk's polished surface. The gesture reminded Bakula of some ritual right before a blessing, although he doubted that it was a blessing the Archbishop had in mind for him at the moment. Perhaps it was a drug addict, some poor soul only looking to find money for his next fix. Bakula restrained himself from laughing. The Archbishop was serious. His youthful face creased with concern. The fingertips continued to tap out some secret code as he added, "It was a random act of violence, was it not?" It's still too early to answer that. So you have no suspects? Not at the moment, Bakula watched to see if the Archbishop looked disappointed or relieved. He couldn't tell. Was the Monsignor having any problems at the school? Bakula asked. Problems? He was the principal of Our Lady of Sorrow, correct? Yes, he was, and he did a fine job. Interesting, Bakula noted. He hadn't asked what kind of job the Monsignor had done, only if there had been any problems. Did he voice any concerns recently? He'd try again. Any trouble with other instructors? Maybe a student? He continued to watch closely, more interested in reaction than verbal responses, although this could be fun if the Archbishop continued to throw in things Bakula didn't ask. Students, he said, but it wasn't a question. Instead, it seemed an idea he hadn't thought of before. He never mentioned any threats. Bakula wanted to smile. He had asked about trouble. The Archbishop had converted it to threats. What the hell was he hiding? We had Father Tony Gallagher down at the station on Saturday. Bakula waited to see what that did to the Archbishop. Although he certainly already knew this, Bakula wondered if it was a sin to bluff an Archbishop. He'd do it anyway. Why did you ask the Monsignor to go to Rome? Was he delivering something to the Vatican for you? Is that what Father Tony told you? He shook his head, disappointed and hesitant about confessing what he was about to say, opening his hands again as if necessary to forgive his priest. I'm afraid there may have been a bit of jealousy. You may find that's true with Sister Kate as well. Both of them have projects that require funds that we just don't have available right now. He shrugged and looked at Bakula as though surely he could understand. Sister Kate? Sister Catherine Rossetti. She teaches history, takes the teenagers on field trips to museums and such. She gives little conferences and seminars in various places. For the most part, her speaking fees cover her own travel expenses, but she seems to think that such travel experiences should be available to her students. We simply can't afford the expense, nor the liability. I'm afraid she can be a bit vocal when she's not pleased, and we've had to cut back on her budget recently. So she's not pleased right now? No, I imagine not. I wouldn't be surprised if she mentioned something. Perhaps she will. I haven't met her yet, but I'm sure I'll be talking to her soon, Bakula said, wondering if Sister Kate had been a bit vocal about the Archbishop cutting her budget, or if the Archbishop had cut her budget because the good sister had been a bit vocal. It didn't matter. What did matter was that there had been no denial about the Monsignor's mission to Rome. The Archbishop's only concern appeared to be about a couple of disloyal shepherds in his flock. Was there something in the missing portfolio, anything that perhaps you asked Monsignor O'Sullivan to deliver to the Vatican? There seems to be no portfolio. The fingers stopped tapping and the hands clasped together. No, you're right. There doesn't seem to have been a portfolio with the Monsignor. Of course, I have no way of knowing that it wasn't there, since Brother Sebastian picked up all of the Monsignor's luggage already from the airport. He waited a beat and then added, illegally. I've instructed him to have all of it ready for you to take back this morning. Never mind that it had already been ransacked, Bakula wanted to say, but let a smile at the corner of his lips do it for him. Hopefully we'll be able to put all of this behind us soon, Archbishop Armstrong said with a sweep of his hands, now standing and putting an end to their meeting. I trust you'll keep me informed. Now Bakula couldn't resist. Chief Ramsey would be pissed, but what the hell, the Archbishop would find out anyway. Certainly it would be in the news by tonight. He stood up and said, I appreciate you taking time to talk to me. I'm sure we'll have more questions, especially after the FBI get here. The FBI? Bakula nodded as he turned to leave. Does Mayor Franklin really think that's necessary to include the FBI? Bakula stopped at the door. So Ramsey was right. Archbishop Armstrong was prepared to round up the yes-men. The power play was on, and Armstrong was announcing his first move. Actually, it's not Mayor Franklin's decision. I'm sure you understand, in a case as sensitive as this, that it's procedure to call in other experts. Oh, of course, the Archbishop said and waved at him as he understood completely. This time he turned to leave out the side door, but stopped in the doorway so that now the two of them were each in an exit, like gunslingers, ready to hurl the last word at each other rather than the last bullet. Of course I understand. We too have procedures that we need to follow. Procedures, for instance, with our college scholarship applications. I'm sure you understand if they're not available. Good day, Mr. Bakula. And he left without Bakula getting a shot at him. It didn't matter. He wasn't sure he would have been able to hurl anything with the knot that suddenly formed in the middle of his chest.